Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. Today we're looking at a new large format gaming monitor from Samsung, the Odyssey Neo G7. No, not that Neo G7, the other one, the 43-inch model, which goes by a variety of names depending on your region. G70NC, 43 Neo G7 4K, or just a long product name that starts with LS43CG70. I'm going to call this big boy Neo G7 just the LS43. I think that keeps things simple. Aside from the 43-inch panel size, we get a range of other high-end specs with the intention of competing with similar sized displays in this class, like the 42-inch LG C-Series OLEDs. We're getting a 4K resolution at up to 144Hz with adaptive sync support, VA LCD technology with claimed 1 millisecond MPRT response times, and what Samsung describes as a quantum mini LED backlight. The marketing image for this makes it seem like the LS43 has a high zone count. In reality, it has just 360 backlight zones, but they are full array, and this does allow for true HDR capabilities, which I'll discuss later on. But before I do,
today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Insta360 and their Link webcam. Boasting clear 4K image quality thanks to its half-inch sensor and very reasonable onboard audio, the Link is an impressive webcam powered by AA technology for a variety of use cases. Its ability to track your face through the use of a 3-axis gimbal makes staying in frame hands-free and simple, and the zoom via hand gesture is also a nice addition. The Link has accurate, snappy autofocus, as well as the ability to view your desk seamlessly via desk view by rotating the gimbal down 45 degrees and automatically adjusting the perspective. For those of you who wish to film or stream in portrait mode, the Link allows you to do so with a 9:16 video mode at the click of a button, which sees the gimbal rotate 90 degrees. The Link really is packed full of features, so for more information, please check the link in the video description.
Priced at $1,000 US, this monitor is geared towards high-end shoppers looking at smaller OLED TVs, QD-OLED ultrawides, mini LED LCDs, and maybe even the 1440p 240Hz OLEDs we've tested recently. It also does provide some upgrades on previous 43-inch panels, which historically have featured garbage HDR with few, if any, backlight zones, and I think in this price class you really can't offer a poor HDR experience anymore. Being a large display, the Neo G7 LS43 basically looks like a TV with a couple of gaming monitor style additions. The front is absolutely dominated by the LCD panel, but you'll also spot some small RGB LED strips in the bottom corners and a reasonable bezel along that bottom edge. What you won't find on the front, sides, or anywhere for that matter are any OSD controls or even a power button. Like a TV, everything is controlled through an included remote. The rear of the monitor is big and uses mostly glossy white plastic with a few patterns and vents around the place. It's not a particularly thick display, not as thin as an OLED, but reasonably thin, which allows for wall mounting. Samsung have clearly thought buyers might want to do this because the port placement is very much like what you see on TVs, with 2 inset sections, one for the display connectors and one for the power connector. However, for those that just want to use this on a normal desk, there's a very basic included stand which only offers tilt functionality, not that I'd be expecting much more from something so large. As I've mentioned in other large monitor reviews, I think 43 inches is pretty much the limit for what you can use at a regular desk with a normal viewing distance. You'll still need a relatively large desk and it will dominate your field of view, but I think it's usable and the corners don't feel too out of reach. So this is great for people that want a more immersive gaming experience or want to do a lot of multitasking utilizing the high resolution at 100% scaling. There's 75% more screen real estate here than a typical 32-inch monitor, which is a lot, and it's about 15 centimeters wider than a 34-inch ultra-wide while being a lot taller. Samsung are using a matte panel here, which I think is the right choice for a PC-oriented product, although of course opinions will vary on this. The matte coating looks good, it's not too grainy, and it prevents mirror reflections. As an LCD, it can also get quite bright, so it can compensate for any diffuse reflectivity. I think it's good to get some variety and choice as well. The OLEDs around this size are mostly glossy, although there are some matte options, so ultimately consumers can pick which they prefer. For port selection, we have one DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC and 2 HDMI 2.1 ports, plus a 2-port USB hub and Ethernet. Both the DisplayPort and HDMI ports support the full 4K 144Hz experience, as the HDMI ports are 48 gigabits per second. Like the OLED G8 we reviewed a few months back, the Neo G7 LS43 is a full-blown smart TV, so it features apps and a whole range of features. I'm sure some people will find this useful, but on a gaming-specific monitor, I'm not convinced app support is necessary, as both PCs and game consoles can run things like Netflix, YouTube, and Amazon Prime Video through their own apps. But the interface is smooth and responsive, plus depending on the input device, the built-in Smart TV apps could be better or more useful for you. But the inclusion of a Smart TV processor with internet connectivity over Wi-Fi or Ethernet does have its benefits in a monitor. Firmware updates are supported over the air, so it will let you know when an update is ready and you can install it within the interface. The processor is also more than capable of handling an impressive range of color controls like color space emulation and multi-point grayscale adjustment at the same time. There's even some decent gaming features like crosshair support and an ultra-wide game view mode that runs the monitor as a 3840 by 1600 ultra-wide with black bars at the top and bottom. Useful if you're finding it difficult to see stuff at the top and bottom of such a large screen in the game you're playing. One of the benefits choosing an LCD over an OLED at this size is text clarity. The LS43 is much more usable as a monitor for desktop apps with 100% display scaling in comparison to WOLED panels at this size, so you can utilize the huge screen real estate with fewer artifacts. It's not perfect or ideal, as we're getting a BGR subpixel layout here instead of the traditional RGB, but at least BGR is somewhat correctable in software in Windows, and even without corrections, it looks far better than WOLED's RWBG or QD-OLED's Triangle RGB. Along with zero risk of burn-in, this makes an LCD like this a much better choice for productivity. There is an enormous downside to the Neo G7 LS43 though, and that's motion performance, which is dead set atrocious for a 144Hz gaming-oriented product. Even with 3 overdrive settings, this display simply isn't capable of decent speed and is nowhere near the performance of the 32-inch Neo G7, which also uses VA technology and is made by Samsung. At 144Hz, the standard overdrive mode is very slow, offering just a 19.6 millisecond average response time with significant amounts of dark smearing. A 34 millisecond dark level average is among the worst I've seen in recent years. There is no overshoot here, which is a good thing, but this can't offset the slow response time average. As we move up to the faster mode, the response average is about 1.5 milliseconds better, which has come at the cost of some overshoot. This mode does look better, but is heavily unbalanced. We've got some extremely slow transitions, particularly falling transitions and dark transitions, and some fast transitions with overshoot. The overdrive tuning here just seems to have failed to give an even experience across all types of transition. Then there's the extreme mode, which is also slow. The response time average is really no better than the faster mode, with some transitions getting faster but others slower. This mode has a higher level of inverse ghosting and a higher error rate, so bright trails behind moving objects are more noticeable, but these just replace the dark smears from the other modes. Cumulative deviation is the highest in this mode, and really none of the 3 overdrive choices delivers acceptable refresh compliance. So while this is a 144Hz monitor, actual response performance limits clarity to around an effective 90 to 100Hz. The story is much the same for variable refresh gamers. The extreme mode does get faster at lower refresh rates, but it is accompanied by higher levels of overshoot. Down below 100Hz, this overshoot is quite noticeable. Meanwhile, the faster mode is a little slower than extreme, but has less overshoot. At 60Hz, this overshoot is still noticeable, but in my opinion looks clearer than the large amounts of ghosting in the standard mode. While I would recommend the faster mode to VRR gamers, it's not a good result, and I don't think this display really qualifies as having a single overdrive mode experience. Also, no combination of overdrive or refresh rate is really able to eliminate dark smearing, although the issue improves the closer you get to 60Hz. Compared to some of the higher end monitors we've reviewed recently, the Neo G7 LS43 has awful performance at the maximum refresh rate. Obviously, compared to an OLED like the C2 or PG42UQ, it's a night and day difference in motion clarity, but the issues go beyond that. For example, compared to the original Neo G7, the LS43 has far inferior tuning. The 43-inch variant is 4 times slower at a comparable level of overshoot. Not only that, it's worse than the previous 43-inch LCD we tested, the FV43U, and it's quite slower than the already quite bad 273CQRX-QD from MSI, both of which use VA panels. Something has clearly gone badly wrong here. It doesn't get any better looking at average performance. There's no mode or configuration that saves this display here. The FV43U is much faster, and even then it's the second slowest monitor in the chart, while once again it gets destroyed by the original Neo G7 despite similar levels of overshoot. An OLED is the ultimate choice, of course, and it's available in similar sizes. Perhaps the most favourable chart for the LS43 is the cumulative deviation chart. Yes, it's still in last place among this collection of monitors, but the gap to other displays has reduced. What I just find baffling is that other sort of slow VA monitors produced a result in the 750 range, while the Neo G7 is at 485. I'm not sure what has caused such a lackluster result. I don't think this is the best tuned monitor, but even then, tuning doesn't explain something like this. Is it just a really bad panel for motion performance? I'm honestly not sure. Dark level performance is not good and one of the key issues with this product. A dark level average more than twice that of the nearest VA competitor, at least that we've shown in this chart, contributes significantly to poor response time averages, but it also just looks bad. This is last generation sorts of performance, maybe even 2 generations ago. 120Hz, in my opinion, is somewhat beyond the reasonable capabilities of this display. The response times seen here are too slow for that refresh rate, and while it does also offer this functionality and smoothness for gamers, it doesn't look good. 60Hz though, this is probably what this panel was designed for, as it's the only result where the LS43 isn't totally destroyed. It's still not a particularly amazing result, but for 60Hz gaming, response times improve and even dark level performance is somewhat better. Input lag isn't the best. Slow response times contribute the most to poor input lag on a monitor like this. The actual processing delay of 3 milliseconds isn't amazing, but it's fine, and for a product that seems to be more of a TV, that sort of lag is decent. But yeah, I wouldn't buy this monitor expecting an excellently responsive or clear gaming experience. Power consumption is great for a 43-inch panel compared to the FV43U. The new Neo G7 LS43 uses 20% less power, which is a good efficiency gain at the same level of brightness, especially given the FALD backlight. It's also much more efficient than similar sized OLEDs when showing full white, most of which can't even reach the full 200 nits required for this test. When looking at UFO test images, we can really see the difference in motion performance and the impact of visual quality that slow response times have. The LS43 has worse trailing than the relatively slow FV43U, with longer ghosting artifacts, especially for those dark lines. It's also clearly worse than the clear LG C2 OLED, despite the C2 running at a lower 120Hz refresh rate. I think there was supposed to be some form of backlight strobing mode available here too. The options are certainly there in the settings menu, but no combination of options I tried unlocked it for us to use. It isn't all bad for the Neo G7 43-inch though. Let's talk about color performance. This is a wide gamut monitor sporting 95% DCI-P3 coverage, which is decent, but we're also getting 78% coverage of Rec 2020, which is very good for HDR content and one of the higher gaming monitor results. The LS43 ends up with a wider color gamut than WOLED monitors, though it's similar to the FV43U. Factory calibration is mediocre. My unit had a slightly yellowish tint out of the box, and combined with wonky gamma performance, we only get average grayscale delta E's. This is combined with some oversaturation, as the monitor does not ship with an sRGB clamp enabled by default, so when viewing SDR content like desktop apps or YouTube videos, saturation is higher than it should be, which some people like but isn't overly accurate. However, with the Smart TV processor inside, the range of color controls is large, so there's plenty of room for calibration. If you just want to flick the monitor from being in the native color space mode to auto, this effectively acts like an sRGB mode. Not a huge improvement to grayscale performance, but saturation is better in this mode, and ultimately this is average performance among gaming monitors when looking at their sRGB modes. Beyond this, we can really begin tweaking and almost hardware calibrate this display. With settings like gamma, color space, shadow detail, and the comprehensive white balance controls all tweaked, we end up with fantastic results that you can't achieve on many other monitors. Grayscale performance is excellent, although the shadow detail setting does reduce contrast to some degree, while saturation and color checker results are above average. So if you do want an accurate monitor with settings saved in hardware, that is possible on this monitor. A full calibration in CalMan to create an ICC profile then provides minor improvements from here and doesn't require the use of the shadow detail setting, so we can maintain the high native contrast ratio and get accurate gamma at the same time. P3 calibrated performance is okay, not full coverage, but decent enough. Maximum brightness in the SDR mode is strong, topping out at 478 nits, which is plenty for most use cases. It's not as bright as the FV43U with an astonishing 781 nits, but it's much brighter than a 42-inch OLED you might be considering, which are lucky to hit 200 nits for full screen white. This is another clear advantage to going LCD over OLED, especially for those in brighter environments. Just don't use this in a super dark room because minimum brightness only hits 117 nits, which is very high and won't be suitable for nighttime use to some users. While local dimming is enabled by default on this screen in the SDR mode, the native contrast of the panel is still very high, at 4425 to 1, effectively the same as the 32-inch variant. This sets a good foundation for local dimming to then work off, and if you do want to disable dimming for productivity apps, you'll still get decent deep blacks and a high contrast ratio. Another significant downside to this panel is its viewing angles. We're not talking TN LCD level bad, but a flat VA of this size isn't ideal, and when moving your head around, you can easily see contrast shift and washing out at off angles. The best experience with the deepest blacks is only available when viewing it mostly in the center. But even then, viewing angles impact the corners of the screen, which appear a bit washed out relative to the center, almost like there's a uniformity issue. But it's not uniformity. It's simply the weak viewing angles of this VA panel and the angle at which you're viewing those corners when looking at the screen from a normal position. The corners are further away on a smaller screen, which means a greater viewing angle and worse results. The actual uniformity of the screen was acceptable. The bottom left and right corners are both a tad worse than the center, but nothing crazy. It's really those viewing angles that are going to affect the perception of a uniform image. HDR Performance with this screen is an interesting one. The previous 43-inch monitor I tested had just 8 dimming zones, but was rated for display HDR 1000 and could hit over 1000 nits. The Neo G7 LS43 has similar specs to that model, the FV43U, but uses a clearly different backlight that includes 360 full array local dimming zones in a 30x12 grid. Brightness has also been reduced, with this version being rated for just display HDR 600. 360 zones is an interesting configuration that I haven't tested yet, especially on a larger panel. The marketing material is a little misleading in that it gives the impression of a higher zone count and references quantum mini LEDs. The actual product could be using mini LEDs, but the zone count isn't overly impressive. So how does a VA panel with 360 zones fare for the all-important contrast metric and ability to deliver a proper HDR experience? Honestly, it's not too bad. Thanks to the high native contrast ratio of the panel, you'll need a big difference in brightness relatively close together to see the blooming from each zone. For a lot of typical HDR content, the FALD system here is effective and is capable of a genuine increase in dynamic range relative to an SDR screen. It's also far superior to edge-lit LCDs, which have to illuminate large sections of the display to accurately display content and often end up just turning on all the zones all the time. There's enough control from the LS43's 360 zones that each zone can dim as necessary, and it's especially good for letterboxed videos, stuff in a 21:9 aspect ratio, because the black bars at the top and bottom can be properly dimmed on a panel like this. However, as we're talking about just a 30x12 grid of dimming zones, each zone is relatively large, so smaller bright elements cause a bit of pain. Things like star fields, Christmas lights, and subtitles will show blooming around those elements simply because the zones can't dim tightly enough. There are some circumstances where we don't get blooming, but brightness is held back. On a 1196 zone FALD monitor like the 32-inch Neo G7, all of these drawbacks are improved quite a bit, though I still believe 360 zones with a high native contrast ratio VA panel is suitable for an entry to mid-level HDR experience. It's not a patch on OLED though, which has per pixel local dimming. We do get true HDR here, but it's simply not at the same level of dimming control and overall contrast. For content with a lot of shadow detail and many small bright elements, OLED has a clear and significant edge for HDR. However, there is an advantage to having an LCD here, and that's brightness. For sustained full screen brightness, the HDR results are similar to the SDR results at 453 nits. Not a huge number, but brighter than the Neo G7 32-inch model, and also much brighter than any OLED we've tested. The very best HDR LCDs are another step above. For 10% brightness, we're looking at around 660 nits, similar to some WOLED monitors, but below a lot of the top-tier HDR LCD options. That's an okay result, but nothing crazy. What we end up with comparing brightness across a range of window sizes is that this sort of LCD panel has an advantage over WOLED and QD-OLED at larger than 10%. Most OLEDs do drop below 500 nits. The LS43 is good for 700 nits. This monitor also never drops below 450 nits, whereas again OLEDs fall away to very low levels, but for smaller windows OLEDs are competitive or brighter, and there are a few LCDs brighter as well, so this is in keeping with what I said about an entry to mid-tier HDR experience. Real scene brightness in the best cases is typically around 600 nits, which I guess you'd expect from something display HDR 600. Again, this is similar to some OLEDs and dimmer than others. It's not a mind-blowing result from LCD, but it meets the minimum level we think is sufficient for true HDR. All of these scenes are tested using smaller elements as well, which is less of a strength of the LCD used here. Contrast results are genuinely pretty good. In the best cases, where bright and dark elements are far apart, we recorded a 500,000 to 1 contrast ratio, so about half that of the Neo G7 with more dimming zones, but above the Cooler Master GP27U, which used 512 zones and an IPS LCD. When those bright and dark elements were close together, the contrast ratio dropped to 7,360 to 1, which is still better than most LCDs tested, though behind the Neo G7. It absolutely smokes the IPS-based GP27U, showing what we've seen previously, that a high native contrast VA with fewer zones can typically outperform a lower native contrast IPS with more zones. Then for the checkerboard test, a high brightness result of 16,234 to 1 is quite good actually, and shows the dimming is providing a 3.7 times multiplier in this test over the panel's native contrast. Samsung have also done a decent job of calibrating this display for HDR. EOTF tracking is very good, and while there is a slight difference between AMD and Nvidia GPU performance, it's not worth worrying about and doesn't affect the experience. Dark level tracking is very strong for an LCD, showing good control for shadow detail, while saturation performance is average. Final section of this review is the Hub Essentials checklist. Samsung do well across the first two sections, only receiving a harsh penalty for lack of height adjustment and for claiming factory calibration, which I think is a bit of an exaggeration based on the performance I saw. Aside from this, other marketing claims are very accurate, including the contrast ratio and brightness. Motion performance is a big issue here, and it's no surprise the LS43 receives numerous penalties here. The claim of a 1 millisecond MPRT response time is misleading, as the real panel performance is nowhere near that, even though maybe it technically does under the MPRT measurement, but anyway, we use gray to gray, we think that's a better metric, and of course there are other issues here too. However, the HDR section is great, and while I have listed here that under 500 dimming zones would be a fail, I've never used a combination of 320 zones with VA before, so I think it would be unfair to get a penalty there when 320 zones seems sufficient for entry-level true HDR with a high contrast VA panel. Anyway, beyond that, the only problem I had was the BGR sub-pixel layout, which isn't as ideal as RGB. At the end of the day, the Samsung Odyssey Neo G7 LS43 is another 43-inch LCD gaming monitor that I find difficult to recommend. There's just something about these particular LCD panels that aren't very impressive, and despite the same problems cropping up across most variants, for whatever reason these issues haven't been resolved over the years. Surely it's time for a full panel revision with better, upgraded technology. The biggest issue with the LS43 is this being called a gaming monitor. I say that because despite offering a 4K resolution and 144Hz refresh rate, actual motion performance is awful. We're getting all the classic VA LCD issues: dark level smearing, painfully slow response times, low refresh compliance, and poor tuning. Visually, ghosting and smearing is quite obvious in any sort of fast motion, and put next to a similarly sized OLED, it's just a complete destruction of this LCD. I really can't recommend a monitor this slow to gamers, and honestly it just seems like this panel wasn't really meant for use in a gaming product. Given the performance it does improve around 60Hz, maybe it was designed more for TVs? It was really disappointing to encounter such bad motion performance because the other Neo G7, the 32-inch model, is basically the complete opposite. It also uses a VA panel, but it's much faster and better tuned with significantly less dark smearing. Clearly whatever tech is being used for that Neo G7 is not being used for this Neo G7. While it's very hard to overcome such a huge negative, there are some things that Samsung have done well. The inclusion of a new 360 zone FLD backlight does give the LS43 true HDR capabilities, and while those capabilities are more towards the entry level of the true HDR range, it can look pretty good displaying HDR content at times. It's a massive upgrade on anything edge-lit, and it's nicely suited to video playback. The LS43 has other strengths for productivity work and general color reproduction. It has a nice high native contrast ratio, wide color gamut, great brightness, and the Smart TV processor provides significant scope for hardware calibration. It is let down somewhat by poor viewing angles, which do affect the corners of such a large screen at desk viewing distances, but there's a lot to work with here when response times don't get in the way. It also has some clear advantages over an OLED of a similar size in some circumstances. Again, this is mostly for productivity, where OLEDs are at risk of permanent burn-in, have low SDR brightness, and use a subpixel structure that isn't great for text rendering. The LS43 uses BGR, which isn't amazing either, but it's better than anything OLED uses, and opens up the possibility of a generally good experience at 100% render scaling, which gives this monitor heaps of screen real estate. So I can see a specific subset of buyers choosing something like this over an OLED, those who are primarily using their display for work and want something big with nice text clarity. For everyone else, I can't recommend buying it, especially at $1,000 US. I've seen discounts take it down to $800 at times, but even then it's just not a very good gaming monitor, and you're much better off trying to find, say, a 42-inch OLED at a similar price, which these days is pretty easy. Disappointing result, I was expecting perhaps closer performance to the pretty great 32-inch model that I'd seen, but it is what it is. Anyway, that's it for this review of the Samsung Odyssey Neo G7 LS43 variant. If you do appreciate the testing that we do at this channel, our independent testing, then please do consider supporting us via Patreon or Floatplane. Links to those are in the description below. Down there you'll also find links to some of the monitors that we've talked about in this review and their latest pricing. So if you're looking at this review, say, several months after it's gone live, then the latest up-to-date pricing will be down below. Also, subscribe to the channel. We're nearly at 100,000 subs at this point, which is pretty good going for this channel that we only started like a year ago. So appreciate everyone that's signed up and is appreciating this monitor content. But yeah, anyway, that's it for this one. I'll catch you in the next one.